as Jonathan says, I've been doing quite a lot of work on Brexit counterfactuals. Like, if we could visit the universe in which Britain remained in the EU, what would things look like? And so Jonathan mentioned it, but we have put out a paper, I think, in January, thinking through some of these issues. And the first thing to say is, it's really difficult. You know, obviously, we can't know with any kind of certainty what the Remain universe would look like. I'm also glad to go second because I can skip through quite a lot of this, and then we can get to the discussion because Madeline has covered quite a lot of it. But the new system, what we call the new system in the paper, is free movement ending and a new skilled worker visa system with fewer restrictions than the old system for non-EU workers. And so the conclusion one would draw before looking at the evidence is the net effect is a more restrictive system for EU workers, so fewer of them, and some liberalisation for non-EU, so more of them. And Jonathan and I provide a kind of fairly descriptive analysis, really, of the impact of the new system on EU and non-EU employment after January 2021. Data sources we can talk about. There are some problems. The key one is that the Labour Force Survey and the annual population survey, which is the one that I'm going to be talking about, had some real problems in the pandemic. And so, you know, kind of deliberately, actually, they were fairly open about this. The government, when they decided that we were going to leave the EU at the end of 2021, they didn't ask for an extension despite the pandemic, in part because they wanted to get on with it, but also in part because the pandemic helped kind of cover up some of the disruption that we're seeing. But this is an issue, and so as with a lot of these counterfactual kind of pieces of work, you need to take this with a bit of a pinch of salt. But I think we use a few different data sources in the paper, HMRC data and so forth, just to try and think through whether our results are plausible. First thing to say, which I don't think has come up yet in the conference, is that migrants made up a very large share of overall UK employment growth in the period running up to the pandemic and Brexit. You can see here on the growth column, there was growth of about 1 million UK origin workers. There's about 700,000 EU workers over 2014 to 2019, and about 600,000 non-EU. So together, EU and non-EU made up a bit more than UK origin workers in terms of new employment, extra employment within the UK. And in terms of the distribution of those workers, sorry this is such a tiny chart, but I'll try and point it out a bit to you. So in terms of the distribution of those workers, if we look at the yellow bars, that's the EU origin workers who are making use of free movement. And you can see, if we look down at the bottom, which is a bit more where some of the lower skilled sectors of the economy are, you can see that the yellow bars are fairly big. You know, wholesale and retail, transport and storage, to a certain extent accommodation and food services, and manufacturing. So we had lots of EU workers going into those sectors where wages are a bit lower, and you know, a lot of the work is not particularly skilled. If we look at non-EU workers, which is the red bars, then we see quite a lot of, the biggest bars are perhaps in health and social care, which we discussed. You know, the NHS is skilled at bringing in skilled workers from non-EU countries to help deal with our lack of skills in this sector. But also in things like professional, scientific and technical, and information and communication. These were quite important sectors for employing non-EU migrants before Brexit and the pandemic. Madeline's already talked about this, so I'm just going to skip it. We had big net change in immigration to 500,000, and worker visas made up also grew rapidly, but made up a smaller share of that net immigration. Okay, so let's get on to the counterfactuals. As I say, you know, this is difficult. We can't visit the Remain universe. And one way that you could try and think about what would have happened if the new system, i.e. end of free movement, some liberalisation for non-EU, if that new system hadn't been instituted, one way you could do that is just say, well, what's the general growth rate, what's the average growth rate before that system was instituted? Let's just project that forward, and then the gap kind of tells you, how many people in work in the UK you've gained or lost from either the EU or the non-EU. But the problem with that is obviously that the pandemic intervened, and the pandemic disrupted employment massively. Lots of people were put on furlough scheme, some people were working from home. We saw that employment generally dipped quite a lot through the pandemic and then recovered. So we need to try and adjust for that somehow. And so the way that we do that is by saying, okay, so we take the average growth rate, let's say, of the EU between 2014 and 2019, and then we say, instead of just projecting that growth rate forward, we adjust it downwards by how much UK employment also fell. And that gives us a bit of a check, a bit of an adjustment for falling labour demand, basically, within the UK economy because of the pandemic. And the results of that are that, lost EU workers, about 450,000. So free movement has had a material impact on the number of EU workers in employment in the UK. And gained non-EU workers, so from the liberalisation of the system that we've seen, about 130,000 workers. So our counterfactual growth is actually lower for non-EU workers than the outturn that we see. We've done a couple of checks which we can discuss, but I think maybe it's a bit too complicated for now. If anyone wants to bring that up, be delighted to hear. We've also done the same exercise, but at a sectoral level. An important thing to consider is that we're using the annual population survey here. At an overall population level, this survey is pretty good. It's a very large sample. But once you get down into sectors, and then you're also breaking sectors down into, is this person a UK origin worker? Is it an EU origin worker? Then the sample sizes get smaller and smaller. So we need to take these with quite a big pinch of salt. Again, this is tiny, which I'm sorry about. But if we look at non-EU workers, then as we've seen, and which Madeline pointed out, health and social work care, non-EU, we've seen a gain of about 74,000 people, and that's about 1.5% of the total workforce in that sector. Education, we've seen a bit of a growth for both, 42,000 and 58,000. I can't really explain that. In many of the other high-skilled sectors, we see some smaller increases. So information and communication for non-EU, then we've seen a growth of about 20,000 workers based upon our counterfactual analysis. Do we expect, is the number that we see in the outturn bigger or smaller than we would expect given projecting the growth rate forward with an adjustment? But, and this is where we get into the labour shortages question, we see some bigger shortfalls in EU workers in terms of our counterfactual coming in below what the outturn is in some key less skilled sectors such as logistics, hospitality, wholesale and retail, admin and support and construction. So this obviously feeds into the policy question which Madeline raised at the end about what, if anything, we should do about this. I'll skip over this because we haven't got much time. Right, summary. So the new system has resulted in a large reduction in EU migration and an increase in non-EU migration. Overall, altogether, that has meant a substantive shortfall in migration for work versus what would have happened if we hadn't instituted the new system. This has been particularly concentrated in lower skilled sectors, which historically had been reliant on free movement. And that migration has not really been replaced by additional visa issuance under the new system. However, there are a few sectors where a substantial proportion of jobs that relied on free movement, a lot of those jobs are in fact eligible for skilled work visas, say for example in construction or transport, where median salaries are higher than the UK average. So we may see employers in those sectors try to do more to recruit people under the new scheme. Few concluding questions. I know you're going to ask the questions, but I wanted to just raise a few. One, will employers who relied on free movement make more use of the new system where they have jobs that pay enough and the skill levels are high enough? If not, will they raise wages, cut output, or invest in automation? Madeline has said those are the three choices if they don't make use of the system. And then finally, should the government consider further relaxation, perhaps on a sectoral basis? Madeline raised this point. I would just like to add one question to her very good summary of the two sides of that argument, which is we have other public policy goals, and where labour shortages are having an impact on those public policy goals, there is a question about whether we should think about some sectoral relaxation. So health and social care has already been relaxed because we obviously have a huge public policy goal there. The other question I have is just about construction. And it's interesting, the FT report today, that the government is mulling lowering some of the restrictions or salary threshold skills, we don't know yet, on construction. Because we have a clear public policy goal there, which is we need to retrofit the housing stock. We need loads of heat pump engineers. We have a huge emissions question in construction. So there may be some reason, other than we should just let the labour market adjust, there may be some other reason why we think actually some sort of sectoral relaxation might be necessary. I'll stop there, and thanks very much.